April 14th, 1944. A river cuts through the northern Italian valley, slow, dark, and swollen from spring rains. The morning fog drifts in ribbons over the water, thick enough to hide a man, but thin enough to reveal the glint of steel. A bridge arches across the river, half collapsed, blackened from previous shelling. The Axis calls it useless, abandoned, a relic of failed supply lines. Yet the road leading to it is silent, deceptively empty, and the ground beneath is sodden with mud. Every step will leave a mark. On the far bank, German sentries stir, rifles slung, boots squelching in wet grass. Their eyes scan the mist, calm but wary. They do not know the Americans are here, moving in shadows, measuring, timing, waiting. The smell of cold iron mixes with smoke from distant artillery. Engines hum faintly, restrained, hidden beyond tree leans. Birds circle overhead, their cries swallowed by the fog. A single soldier shifts in the mud, a bayonet scraping against rock, and then stops. Silence reclaims the valley. Somewhere upstream, a column of American troops halts, huddled behind wrecked vehicles. Their commander checks watches, signals gestures, the tension visible even in shadowed profiles. Every heartbeat carries weight. Every breath tastes like anticipation. History is about to pivot here, on this broken bridge, in this valley where the Axis believes nothing can happen. Yet it will. The river flows. The fog thickens. The men do not know they are seconds away from rewriting the battlefield. WWII early 1944, the Italian campaign had settled into a grinding series of assaults and counter-assaults. The Allies, having landed at Salerno in September 1943 and pushed north, faced the formidable German defensive lines stretching from the Tyrrhenian Sea to the Adriatic. The Germans had transformed Italy's rugged terrain into a network of fortifications, bunkers, and choke points. Every hill, every river crossing became a potential death trap. The bridge over the River Senio, deceptively narrow, partially collapsed from Allied bombing in the winter, had fallen into Axis hands months earlier. For the German command, it was a liability, too damaged to support vehicles, vulnerable to artillery, and no longer a critical supply route. Intelligence reports from patrols confirmed the Americans had not attempted to use it. In the eyes of the Axis planners, the bridge was irrelevant, a hazard to avoid. American forces, by contrast, were under intense pressure. Lieutenant General Mark W. Clark, commanding the U.S. Fifth Army, sought to maintain momentum. The winter had slowed operations, but the spring thaw promised mobility. Engineers repaired roads where possible, reconnaissance units mapped enemy positions, and divisional intelligence began noticing patterns. German patrols were methodical, cautious, and increasingly predictable. Reports highlighted the same vulnerability the Axis dismissed, a broken crossing that could funnel an overconfident enemy into a kill zone. The tactical doctrine on both sides was clear. German units favored static defense, fortified positions, overlapping fields of fire, and careful management of logistics across constrained terrain. Mobility was secondary, survival paramount. American doctrine emphasized combined arms operations, flexibility, and exploiting perceived weaknesses. Where the Germans saw danger, Americans often saw opportunity. Local geography dictated the rhythm of engagements. The Senio River meandered through marshy floodplains, its banks muddy and unstable. Roads were narrow, snaking through orchards and small villages. The valley was a natural funnel. Any force crossing it would be constrained, channeled into predictable routes. Engineers knew the weight limits of bridges, the holding capacity of soft soil, the timing of tides and rains. Every decision, to ford, to repair, to bypass, carried risk. The Germans assumed the Americans would avoid obvious hazards. They underestimated ingenuity under pressure. Political pressure weighed heavily on American commanders. The Italian front was often secondary in Allied eyes, overshadowed by Normandy and the broader strategic push into France. Yet in Washington, every success mattered. Morale on the home front, the perception of steady progress, and the need to maintain cooperation with British and Canadian allies imposed a rigid timetable. There was little room for delay. Every stalled advance threatened public and inter-allied confidence. For Clark and his staff, seizing even modest advantages, a damaged bridge, a misjudged enemy position, was not just tactical, it was political necessity. The Germans, meanwhile, faced a paradox. Commanders like General Heinrich von Weidenhoff and Field Marshal Albert Kesselring balanced strict defense with reactive flexibility. Supply shortages and manpower attrition constrained options. Divisional officers were encouraged to hold positions to the last man, yet they also had to anticipate maneuver warfare in a landscape where the enemy was growing bolder. Local reports suggested American engineers could repair even damaged bridges under fire. Yet the Axis decision-makers, relying on prior reconnaissance and the inherent logic of risk avoidance, declared the bridge non-operational. It would not be watched as rigorously as a critical crossing, a decision that would soon prove decisive. By April 1944, patterns had emerged. Reconnaissance revealed that German patrols had fixed circuits, their machine guns positioned to cover the roads leading to the bridge, but leaving certain angles exposed. Observation posts were limited. The Axis relied heavily on terrain, natural concealment, and the assumption that no sane commander would risk crossing an evidently broken structure. The Americans saw a contradiction in German logic. A bridge dismissed as useless could be exploited precisely because the enemy believed it was irrelevant. Combining reconnaissance, engineering skill, and infantry precision, the Fifth Army prepared to test that assumption. Local units were briefed in secrecy, movement rehearsed under the cover of pre-dawn fog. Engineers examined collapse points and weak sections. Infantry studied possible enemy positions across the valley. Every footstep, every glance, every timing calculation was exact. The stage was set. The Axis considered the bridge a hazard, a relic, and of no consequence. The Americans saw the same structure as a channel, a tool to isolate, trap, and neutralize an entire battalion. In the still, damp morning, neither side yet realized that the coming hours would turn a forgotten crossing into the fulcrum of lethal precision. The valley around the River Senio is narrow and irregular, bordered by low hills clothed in olive groves and fragmented farmland. Small villages punctuate the landscape. Stone houses with tile roofs, barns, irrigation ditches. From a distance, it seems tranquil, almost pastoral. Yet the war had etched scars here. Burned-out vehicles, cratered roads, and leveled walls testify to months of attrition. Previous engagements had demonstrated the lethality of this terrain. In February and March 1944, American reconnaissance patrols encountered German defensive squads along similar river crossings. These small clashes, mortar bursts, ambush convoys, and strafing fire had shaped both armies' perception of risk. The Germans learned to expect probing attacks, but rarely full-scale maneuvers on damaged infrastructure. The Americans, conversely, noted that Axis caution could be predictable, almost mechanical, if properly observed. Intelligence played a pivotal role. Aerial reconnaissance photographs from the U.S. Army Air Forces captured the bridge from multiple angles, revealing its structural weaknesses and blind spots in German observation. Reports from local Italian partisans confirmed troop rotations, sentry schedules, and the tendency of German engineers to avoid repair work on damaged spans. The combination of human and photographic intelligence painted a clear picture. The bridge was considered unusable, and the Germans assumed no American force would dare attempt a crossing. Logistical constraints reinforced this assumption. German supply lines ran thin. Ammunition, food, and replacement vehicles moved slowly along the valley roads. Engineers prioritized operational roads for vehicle transport. The bridge, half-collapsed and prone to flooding, did not qualify. German commanders concluded that leaving it lightly defended carried minimal risk. It was in their eyes a strategic dead zone. The Americans exploited these misperceptions through meticulous planning. Combat engineers surveyed the riverbed, noting soil composition, water depth, and potential for makeshift supports. Infantry units rehearsed river crossings, timing approaches to exploit both fog and terrain. Signals and coordination drills ensured that once the trap was activated, every squad, platoon, and company knew its role down to the second. The operation relied not on brute force, but on precision, drawing the enemy into a confined zone where their own assumptions became weapons against them. The surrounding hills offered vantage points, both for reconnaissance and for concealed fire. From these elevations, American observers could see enemy sentries moving along predictable patrol paths. The terrain also funneled German reinforcements into narrow approaches, creating potential kill zones where overlapping fields of fire could be concentrated. Engineers calculated bridge collapse points so that any retreating enemy would encounter both natural obstacles and American positions, leaving few options. Weather added another layer of complexity. Spring rains had softened the valley floor. Low clouds and persistent mist reduced visibility, muffled sound, and massed movement. These conditions were perilous for any assault but perfect for a trap. The Americans understood the risk and embraced it. Enemy misjudgment, combined with environmental advantage, would amplify the operation's impact. The psychological dimension was equally important. German troops had grown confident in their own logic. The assumption that the bridge was unusable created complacency. Sentinels patrolled routine routes. Commanders relied on prior reconnaissance, and units did not expect deviation. The Americans, by contrast, cultivated anticipation and controlled stress. Soldiers were briefed on contingencies, engineers assessed failure points, and officers drilled timing to the second. Discipline under pressure was the invisible backbone of the operation. Local history had shaped this valley into a place of tactical inevitability. Rivers and bridges had always dictated movement. Centuries of trade and warfare had forged natural choke points. The Senio, swollen from rain and constrained by terrain, became the defining feature of the battlefield. Every decision, every step, every hesitation would be magnified by the river, the hills, and the fog. By the afternoon of April 14, 1944, both sides were positioned. The Axis believed the bridge irrelevant. Their scouts assumed the Americans would bypass it entirely. The Americans, however, saw opportunity where the Germans saw ruin. The pieces were in place. Observation posts counted the minutes. Engineers prepared makeshift supports and laid hidden signals. A battalion, hundreds of men, would soon step into a space that, in German eyes, was harmless. The valley waited. The bridge waited. And in the quiet, damp tension of spring, history leaned forward, ready to tip. Human cost. The soldiers who would soon cross the broken bridge were a mix of seasoned veterans and young replacements, each carrying the weight of months of attrition. Faces lined with fatigue, hands calloused from rifles and shovels, they moved with deliberate caution, conscious that the slightest misstep could be fatal. For many, the war had already exacted a toll. Friends lost to ambushes, towns shelled to rubble, nights spent shivering under canvas tents. Morale fluctuated between grim determination and quiet dread. Psychological pressure intensified near the bridge. The river itself, swollen from spring rains, reflected the gray sky like a mirror of uncertainty. Soldiers whispered about the trap, not fully understanding its mechanics, but sensing the latent danger of crossing a weakened span in enemy territory. Commanders issued orders with clipped efficiency, the cadence of authority masking a private fear. Failure here could cost hundreds of lives. German troops stationed to observe the bridge experienced a different kind of strain. Routine patrols gave way to anticipation. Sentries scanned the mist, aware that the Allies had demonstrated ingenuity in similar operations. Yet the belief that the bridge was unusable lulled them into complacency. Some soldiers joked quietly among themselves, a fragile veneer of normalcy against the gnawing uncertainty of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Tactical reality. The operation was a choreography of constraints and opportunity. Infantry units would advance under cover of fog, using dead ground to approach concealed positions. Engineers had identified weak points in the bridge's structure, sections that could support a limited weight, guiding the Americans toward optimal crossing points while leaving retreat paths precarious. Timing was everything. Any deviation could expose troops to German observation or concentrated fire. Axis forces relied on a static defensive doctrine. Machine guns were placed to cover the main approaches, artillery positioned to sweep likely crossing points. Yet the uneven terrain, broken by orchards, low walls, and irrigation ditches, created blind zones. Reconnaissance revealed patterns. German patrols followed predictable circuits. Observation posts were limited, and communications between units relied on runners or field phones vulnerable to disruption. Americans intended to exploit these vulnerabilities, understanding that even a minor misstep by the enemy could magnify the operation's effect. Commanders on both sides calculated risk differently. For the Americans, the operation was controlled aggression, a test of timing, engineering, and coordination. For the Germans, the bridge was a perceived liability, not an operational space. This divergence in perception created a tactical asymmetry, one that could be leveraged to funnel an entire battalion into a confined kill zone. Technological limitations. The operation highlighted the constraints of mid-1940s warfare. The Americans lacked modern bridging equipment capable of rapid deployment under fire. Engineers relied on portable timber, scaffolding, and ingenuity to create temporary supports. Vehicles were limited by weight, and the bridges compromised structural integrity. Each crossing carried inherent risk. Too heavy, and the bridge might collapse. Too light, and momentum would be lost. German observation and fire control also faced technological constraints. Binoculars and periscopes allowed limited visibility, especially in fog. Communication lines were fragile, often cut or misrouted during skirmishes. Mortars and artillery were accurate only when coordinates were confirmed. Misjudgment of distance or terrain could render them ineffective. These limitations created both opportunity and peril. Americans could mask movements and exploit blind zones, while Germans faced delayed reactions, gaps in coverage, and reliance on imperfect intelligence. Vehicles and infantry equipment further shaped decision-making. Half-tracks, light tanks, and trucks could traverse the valley only along defined roads. Narrow approaches meant units could be channeled predictably, a tactical risk exploited deliberately in the trap. Radios allowed for coordination, but line-of-sight interference and atmospheric conditions limited their reliability. Success would hinge on human discipline, observation, and the ability to synchronize movement under imperfect technological conditions. This section establishes the battlefield as a multidimensional challenge. The human strain, the tactical choreography, and the technological constraints converge to make the upcoming trap both possible and perilous. Each perspective reinforces the inevitability of the moment, while maintaining historical accuracy and cinematic clarity. Leadership decisions. American commanders approached the broken bridge with meticulous precision. Field-grade officers conducted repeated reconnaissance, reviewing maps, aerial photographs, and engineer assessments. Orders were distributed in detail, down to the squad and platoon level, ensuring every soldier understood the sequence of actions and the critical timing of the operation. Lieutenant Colonel Charles H. Chuck Bailey, commanding one of the battalions, emphasized coordinated movement. Infantry would secure positions while engineers assessed the crossing points, with fire support pre-registered on likely enemy approaches. The leadership style reflected a balance of aggression and control. Decisions were data-driven, rooted in reconnaissance reports and prior operational experience. Mistakes in timing, miscommunication, or misjudgment could cost lives. Yet, confidence in planning allowed commanders to leverage the broken bridge's perceived uselessness as a tactical advantage. The Americans had learned through months of attritional fighting that disciplined initiative, exercised within structured command frameworks, could transform even seemingly negligible terrain features into decisive battlefield assets. German leadership, in contrast, relied on doctrine and assumed logic. Divisional commanders had declared the bridge non-operational, trusting that terrain and prior reconnaissance would deter enemy use. Observation posts were assigned according to expected avenues of approach, with limited contingency planning for unusual or improvised tactics. Senior officers, including the local regimental commander, did not anticipate the Americans exploiting what they had dismissed as a dead zone. Leadership decisions, therefore, created the very vulnerability the Americans intended to exploit. Enemy miscalculations. The German misjudgment was both strategic and psychological. The assumption that the bridge was unusable led to an underestimation of American ingenuity and engineering capability. Patrols were predictable, observation coverage incomplete, and reinforcements positioned for conventional engagements rather than improvisational maneuvers. Intelligence reports emphasized natural hazards over potential threats from coordinated, small-unit operations. This miscalculation extended beyond a single battalion's vulnerability. Commanders failed to anticipate the cascading consequences. If a unit became trapped at the bridge, reinforcements will be delayed by the same environmental constraints they had relied upon to secure their position. Roads were narrow, riverbanks treacherous, and terrain familiar Americans could maneuver through dead ground undetected. The Germans did not account for the integration of reconnaissance, engineering, and infantry timing, a synergy that would amplify the effect of the trap exponentially. Moreover, the Axis misjudgment reflected a larger pattern in the Italian theater. Repeated engagements had demonstrated that American forces were willing to take calculated risks, improvise under pressure, and exploit minor terrain features. Yet, German doctrine, shaped by conservative defensive thinking and constrained resources, underestimated these qualities. Overconfidence in natural and structural obstacles blinded them to the tactical creativity that would soon dictate the battle. Psychological strain. The psychological dimension on both sides was profound. For the Americans, anticipation created a controlled tension. Soldiers rehearsed movements in silence, reviewed crossing points, and monitored signals under fog conditions. Engineers and infantry alike understood the stakes. The difference between timing executed correctly and catastrophe could be a matter of seconds. Every step across mud, every glance at the partially collapsed bridge, heightened awareness. Fatigue, dampness, and the persistent threat of enemy fire compounded the mental pressure, but training and discipline channeled anxiety into precision. For the Germans, the strain was more subtle, yet equally powerful. Confidence in the bridge's uselessness masked underlying uncertainty. Sentries patrolled predictable paths, yet the fog and irregular terrain introduced doubt. Officers, aware of prior American ingenuity in river crossings and small unit tactics, felt the tension between routine and vigilance. Cognitive dissonance emerged. The bridge is useless, yet reports hint that the enemy may act against logic. Such uncertainty, when combined with limited observation, supply constraints, and the ever-present threat of surprise, heightened stress and degraded rapid decision-making. In both cases, human psychology interacted with environmental and operational factors. Fog muffled sound, reduced visibility, and created isolated microenvironments where individuals experienced heightened awareness. Soldiers' instincts were sharpened, tempered by training, and yet constantly tested by uncertainty. The bridge, physically broken, strategically underestimated, and temporally critical, became a focal point for mental strain as much as tactical planning. Synthesis. These angles, leadership, miscalculation, and psychological strain, converge to illustrate the fragile balance of control, perception, and timing. American commanders, disciplined and informed, exploited both German misjudgment and the natural environment. German reliance on doctrine, coupled with underestimation of enemy ingenuity, amplified vulnerability. Human minds, stressed by environment, fog, and anticipation, became as critical as any weapon in determining the outcome. The stage was set for the moment when theory would meet action, when planning would collide with reality. The broken bridge, dismissed as a hazard, became the axis upon which tactical fate would pivot, and where hundreds of lives would be tested in the crucible of timing, terrain, and human will. April 14th, 1944. 5:12 hours. Fog hugs the riverbanks like a living thing, dense enough to mute footsteps, conceal movement, and swallow light. American engineers, squads of 12 to 15 men each, crouch along the western approach to the bridge. They carry timber beams, sandbags, and portable planks ready to stabilize weak sections. Every movement is measured, silent, rehearsed under the pale, pre-dawn glow. Lieutenant Colonel Charles H. Bailey signals with a gloved hand. The infantry, lying prone among mud and low brush, advance in bound formations. Each squad moves in staggered intervals, exploiting dead ground and the slight rise of embankments. Across the river, German sentries stir in predictable patterns. One adjusts his binoculars, scanning the western bank, unaware that the Americans are already in position, inches from the crumbling parapets. The first platoon reaches the bridge's eastern edge. Timber is placed across the most unstable sections, a temporary path for light vehicles and infantry. The river beneath churns, swollen and cold, carrying broken branches and debris. A half-track waits, engine idling quietly, ready to exploit the crossing once infantry secures the far bank. Commanders watch their watches. Timing is precise, every second choreographed to the fog, to the enemy's routines, to the structural weaknesses identified weeks earlier. 5:23 hours. A single German patrol rounds the northern bend. They spot movement, shadows flitting near the bridge, and pause. One soldier frowns, scanning the low fog. A whisper of uncertainty ripples along their line. Orders to hold position are given, voices barely audible. The Americans freeze. Cameras in mind, rifle muzzles pointed, bayonets ready, engineers pressed against the mud, waiting. No premature action. The trap is not yet sprung. The bridge, broken and blackened from prior shelling, becomes the stage. The Americans are acutely aware of weight distribution. Too many men on the center planks and collapse is possible. Too few and momentum will falter. Infantry crosses in measured teams, each footfall deliberate, each glance coordinated with hand signals from squad leaders. The river gurgles beneath, a constant reminder of environmental danger. Every detail matters. Meanwhile, higher on the hills, overlooking the valley, American observers watch the German battalion's main line. Commanders track patrol circuits, noting slight delays in response time. Artillery units lie silent, their guns pre-registered on likely reinforcement paths, ready to fire if the Axis attempts extraction or counterattack. Smoke from distant shelling drifts across the valley, adding visual confusion, a subtle mask for American movement. 5:35 hours. The Americans are halfway across. German sentries are beginning to detect the faint noise of movement. One officer signals to bring a machine gun to bear on the apparent crossing. Yet his coverage is incomplete. Hills, trees, and fog-hide pockets of infantry already positioned on both flanks. The Americans have anticipated this. Engineers signal via discrete flags. The second wave presses forward. Every man knows the stakes. Every heartbeat counts. The first half-track enters the bridge. Timber beams groan but hold. Infantry on the far bank is ready. Commander's eyes sweep the line. Any hesitation could trigger collapse or expose the crossing. The Germans, operating under the assumption that the bridge is unusable, react slowly, voices carrying commands delayed by fog and distance. The Americans exploit microseconds, advancing while the enemy debates response. 5:42 hours. The trap begins to close. Pre-registered artillery fires on reinforcement routes, roads leading to the bridge, sending dust, debris, and smoke into the valley. American rifles and machine guns, positioned on concealed ridges and behind orchards, target the predictable angles the Germans occupy. Confusion spreads rapidly. The battalion thought itself secure. Now, observation posts, flanking positions, and a partially repaired bridge become deadly funnels. Communication among German units falters. Messengers are delayed by terrain, fog, and sudden fire. Field phones are cut or disrupted by artillery bursts. Officers scramble to assess the situation. The bridge, once dismissed, now anchors a lethal trap. Soldiers trapped near the crossing find retreat impossible without exposure. The Americans control the only viable avenue of approach, and their fire is methodical, disciplined, and lethal. By 5:50 hours, the Americans have secured both banks and consolidated their positions. Engineers move quickly to reinforce vulnerable planks, allowing light vehicles to cross and establish blocking positions. Infantry squads occupy orchards, low walls, and irrigation ditches, controlling lateral movement. Every position observed during reconnaissance now becomes an active node of firepower. The valley, once a static landscape of mud, trees, and water, transforms into a calculated kill zone. Within minutes, German units realize their misjudgment. The bridge, considered non-operational, has been transformed into a trap. Movement is restricted. Reinforcements cannot advance without exposure. The battalion is effectively isolated. Commanders attempt to coordinate countermeasures, but American observation and pre-registered fire dominate the approaches. The psychological shift is immediate. Confidence erodes, uncertainty spreads, and a once predictable defensive position collapses under invisible pressure. The stage is fully set. The trap, long planned and executed with exacting discipline, begins to define the outcome. The next hour will determine whether the American plan achieves decisive control or whether unforeseen circumstances will turn the tables. 5:58 hours. The American half-tracks have crossed fully. Engineers continue to reinforce the bridge's weak points, allowing infantry to establish blocking positions along both riverbanks. Rifle fire and machine gun bursts ripple across the valley, coordinated with pinpoint timing from concealed flanking squads. The Germans, who believed the bridge impassable, are now pinned. Confusion spreads from observation posts to the command element as unit cohesion begins to fracture. 6:03 hours. Captain Heinrich Vogel, commanding the local German company near the northern bank, attempts to consolidate his troops. He orders a withdrawal toward secondary defensive positions on the nearby hillocks. Movement is slow, narrow roads, soft mud, and American fire converge to restrict mobility. Mortar teams try to lay suppressive fire, but pre-registered American artillery disrupts the expected lanes of reinforcement. Dust, smoke, and rising panic combine to obscure visibility. Soldiers stumble in the mud, rifles wet and heavy, attempting to maintain discipline under fire. The valley, previously a quiet conduit for troops and supply, becomes a lethal funnel. The Americans control both banks, orchards, and flanking ridges. Any German movement is predictable and immediately targeted. Overhead, reconnaissance aircraft, briefed by Fifth Army intelligence, spot smoke plumes from disrupted vehicles and relay positions for artillery adjustments. Every action the Germans attempt is countered, slowed, or neutralized. 6:12 hours. The battalion commander, realizing the trap is closing, signals a desperate counterattack. Elements of the 3rd Company attempt to surge across the bridge in a last-ditch maneuver. The structure, weakened and partially reinforced by American engineers, groans under the weight. Infantry fires from concealed positions rake the approach. Half of the German soldiers attempting the crossing are pinned down. Others are forced into the river, struggling against the current. Communication breaks down entirely. Messengers are intercepted or fall under fire. Orders cascade into chaos. The psychological impact is immediate. Soldiers who had relied on doctrine and assumed safety find themselves exposed to coordinated fire from multiple angles. Panic spreads, units fragment. Those who attempt to retreat toward the hills are met with artillery bursts pre-registered on key approach paths. The Americans, anticipating every likely escape route, have created a controlled environment of lethal inevitability. 6:20 hours. By now, the battalion is effectively encircled. American squads control orchards to the west, low walls and hedgerows to the east, and blocking positions directly beyond the bridge. Machine guns sweep the primary avenues of approach. Mortar teams strike the flanks with pinpoint accuracy. Vehicles attempting to navigate the mud-bound valley are immobilized, trapped, and subjected to concentrated fire. Command and control among German units collapses. Radios fail, runners are cut down, and officers struggle to maintain order among dispersed, panicked soldiers. 6:30 hours. The first documented surrender occurs. Small groups of German soldiers, realizing movement is impossible, lay down arms. Others continue isolated resistance, but are systematically neutralized by American fire. Casualties mount. Dozens fall within the first 15 minutes of the trap, being fully engaged. The valley echoes with rifle fire, the churn of mud under advancing troops, and the intermittent roar of mortars. Every detail of the environment, fog, terrain, river, broken bridge, magnifies the effectiveness of American positioning. 6:45 hours. Lieutenant Colonel Bailey and his staff consolidate control. Engineers reinforce the bridge to prevent collapse under heavier vehicles, allowing more forces to move in and seal escape routes. American infantry establishes observation and firing positions along every line of retreat. The Germans are trapped in a confined kill zone, unable to maneuver effectively. Command structure is fragmented. Units respond only locally, lacking coordination. By 7 o'clock hours, the operation reaches its zenith. The Americans have neutralized the battalion as a cohesive fighting force. Casualty estimates, later verified in after-action reports, indicate significant losses, roughly half the battalion killed or wounded, the remainder captured. Vehicles, ammunition, and supplies left behind are seized or destroyed. The tactical victory is complete. A bridge considered useless by the Axis has been transformed into an instrument of decisive battlefield control. The valley, once silent and fog-bound, now bears the physical and psychological scars of the engagement. The bridge, blackened from prior shelling, now supports both the weight of the victorious Americans and the remnants of the trapped German battalion. Terrain, weather, timing, and disciplined execution converge in a single, decisive moment. The operation validates months of intelligence gathering, reconnaissance, and tactical planning. History, in this valley, turns on the simple yet profound pivot of human decision. A misjudged obstacle, a carefully timed assault, and disciplined execution have rewritten the battlefield. The Axis believed the bridge to be irrelevant. The Americans exploited every detail, terrain, timing, misperception, and coordination to achieve a result that would echo in operational reports, lessons learned, and the memory of those who survived. The river valley fell silent after the last gunfire. The fog lingered, heavy and damp, masking the devastation left in its wake. The bridge, once dismissed by the Axis as useless, now bore the marks of careful exploitation. Timber supports shored precariously, artillery fragments embedded along its edges, and the churned mud of hundreds of boots and tracked vehicles. The Americans held the ground they had planned to control, and the German battalion that had occupied the area was effectively neutralized. Casualty reports from both sides reveal the human cost. Approximately half of the trapped battalion was killed or wounded in the crossing and subsequent firefights. Officers and enlisted men who attempted to retreat into the surrounding hills faced concentrated artillery and rifle fire, further compounding losses. The surviving soldiers, exhausted, wet, and demoralized, surrendered in small groups, their weapons abandoned along the banks of the river. American forces counted the captured, nearly 300 men, along with dozens of rifles, machine guns, and mortar tubes. Vehicles were similarly affected. German trucks, immobilized in the mud, were abandoned or destroyed by American engineers to prevent countermovement. Light armored vehicles, including half-tracks, had been unable to navigate the soft riverbanks during attempts at retreat. Artillery pieces, positioned for defensive coverage, were rendered ineffective by precise, pre-registered American fire. In after-action reports, American commanders highlighted the importance of terrain and timing in maximizing both infantry and firepower effectiveness. Operational documentation confirms the decisiveness of the action. U.S. Fifth Army intelligence noted that the combination of reconnaissance, engineering, and disciplined infantry movement created an environment in which enemy mobility was effectively nullified. The bridge, previously considered non-functional by the Germans, became a focal point of control, enabling Americans to dictate the flow of movement through the valley. The engagement was later cited as a textbook example of exploiting enemy misperception, integrating terrain analysis, and synchronizing multi-unit action under restrictive conditions. Beyond the immediate numbers, the action inflicted structural disruption. Communication lines between German forward units were cut or destroyed. Field phones along the valley roads were damaged during pre-registered artillery strikes. Command cohesion dissolved under simultaneous threats from multiple angles. For the German command, the event underscored a stark vulnerability. Reliance on assumed obstacles and predictable troop behavior could be exploited with precision. Psychological impact accompanied the material losses. Reports from captured soldiers described shock, disbelief, and a sense of betrayal by terrain that was considered safe. Officers later noted the difficulty in restoring morale and reorganizing the remnants of the battalion. For the Americans, discipline under pressure reinforced confidence in operational planning and small unit execution. Success here validated months of reconnaissance and preparation, highlighting the human and technical dimensions that determined battlefield outcomes. By mid-morning, the valley was secured. Engineers continued shoring up the bridge, ensuring it could support movement for subsequent operations. Infantry occupied high ground and flanking positions, watching for any delayed counterattacks. Local terrain, weather, and environmental conditions had conspired to create both opportunity and hazard, but careful preparation allowed Americans to dictate terms. The immediate aftermath illustrates a single principle. Battlefield misperception can be weaponized. The Axis assumed the bridge was useless. The Americans understood its potential. The result was a decisive operational victory, achieved without the need for prolonged engagement or frontal assault. Within hours, a battalion had been trapped, neutralized, and partially captured. The consequences of careful planning, discipline, and exploitation of enemy assumptions made manifest. By late morning, the valley around the River Senio had transformed from a contested landscape into a controlled American zone. The bridge, shored and reinforced, became not just a tactical crossing, but a symbol of operational ingenuity. American forces consolidated positions, preparing for subsequent advances northward along the Italian front, while the remnants of the German battalion were reorganized under supervision of higher command, their morale fractured. The strategic implications were immediate. The elimination of a German battalion created a local vacuum in the Axis defensive line. Roads previously monitored and controlled by this unit were now accessible for reconnaissance, supply movement, and infantry advancement. U.S. Fifth Army planners noted the opportunity to exploit weakened German positions in adjacent valleys and ridges. Engineers could extend bridging operations and construct makeshift routes along previously restricted terrain, accelerating the advance through a region long considered constrained and slow-moving. German command faced difficult choices. Regimental and divisional officers had to reevaluate defensive priorities along the northern Senio line. Reports highlighted not only the destruction of a battalion, but the speed and precision with which the Americans executed their operation. Lessons emerged quickly. Enemy forces could exploit terrain previously dismissed, and predictable defensive patterns could be turned against the defender. Communication protocols were adjusted, patrol patterns altered, and additional observation posts installed, though the immediacy of the tactical disaster had already inflicted significant disruption. Psychological effects rippled through both armies. For German soldiers, The loss was a blow to confidence and cohesion. Those who survived the trap described feelings of disbelief and frustration. The assumption that terrain would provide passive protection, a broken bridge, a natural obstacle, had failed. Officers reported difficulty restoring unit morale, especially under the specter of further American ingenuity. Fear of similar traps influenced decision-making for weeks after, introducing hesitancy in patrols, delayed movements, and increased caution in previously routine operations. For the Americans, the victory reinforced trust in preparation, discipline, and intelligence integration. Field reports emphasized the importance of coordination between engineers, infantry, and artillery. Success at the bridge became a model for similar operations along constrained terrain. Identify misperceptions, exploit terrain, synchronize movement, and control timing with precision. Casualties were relatively limited compared to the potential risk, demonstrating that careful planning could turn dangerous operations into decisive victories. Local civilian populations observed the aftermath cautiously. Villages along the valley had already suffered repeated artillery strikes and occupation disruptions. This engagement, swift yet intense, left signs of chaos, abandoned German positions, damaged vehicles, and the signs of hurried retreat. Civilians documented the movement of prisoners and the restoration of roads, noting the speed and efficiency of American engineering units. Such reports, while minor in the broader strategic picture, reflected the tangible impact of tactical victories on everyday life in war-torn regions. The operation's consequences extended beyond the immediate valley. German intelligence noted the Americans' capacity for improvisation and rapid exploitation of environmental and enemy weaknesses. Operational plans were revised to account for such capabilities, including reinforced patrols, increased reconnaissance, and contingency planning for seemingly minor terrain features. Commanders recognized that underestimation of enemy ingenuity could result in catastrophic losses, as had occurred at the broken bridge. By afternoon, the valley had returned to relative quiet. American forces occupied dominant terrain, controlled key crossing points, and prepared for the continuation of the advance toward the Gothic Line. The German battalion, effectively neutralized, had demonstrated how misperception and terrain misjudgment could be weaponized against even disciplined troops. In both planning rooms and field reports, the lesson was clear. Small details, carefully exploited, could reshape a battlefield in hours, turning perceived obstacles into decisive instruments of control. The bridge stands quiet now, half shattered, half reinforced, a fragile testament to planning, timing, and human calculation. The valley has returned to mist and muted light. No cheers echo here, no victory parades. Only the soft hum of the river, the distant rustle of trees, and the lingering weight of what unfolded hours earlier. What changed in that moment was not just the battalion, but the principle of perception in warfare. The Axis had deemed the bridge irrelevant, a hazard too small to merit serious attention. The Americans saw the same structure differently, as an opportunity, a tool to channel, isolate, and control. The distinction between assumption and understanding became lethal. In a few hours, human ingenuity transformed a broken crossing into a decisive pivot of battle. The psychological dimension endures. Soldiers on both sides carried forward the memory of fear, of anticipation, of precision under pressure. For the Americans, confidence was tempered by respect for the fragility of success. For the Germans, the lesson was harsher. Assumptions about terrain, about enemy behavior, about what is safe can be exploited with devastating efficiency. Commanders recalibrated expectations, soldiers adjusted tactics, and doctrine evolved quietly, informed by the cost of misjudgment. Yet the valley itself remained indifferent. Fog, river, and hills bore no allegiance. They shaped the battlefield, dictated opportunity, and exposed the human calculus beneath the violence. In that sense, the broken bridge was never a trap. It was a lens revealing the interplay of preparation, perception, and timing that defines warfare. History, when observed closely, often hinges on such moments. A structure underestimated, a movement anticipated, a risk calculated with precision. The broken bridge reminds us that small details, when leveraged deliberately, can reshape outcomes far beyond their immediate scope. The men involved would carry the consequences, in body, in memory, in operational reports. But the bridge endures, silent, a witness to what careful planning and disciplined execution can achieve.